In chapter 5 of his book, Mill raises the question of how ethics and justice are related, how it is that the greatest happiness principle expresses itself with regard to issues of justice. There are three notable situations where we need to call on the GHP in order to ensure that justice is taking place. Those are, if we find that some of our laws are unjust, when we're trying to come up with a fair system of imposing taxes, and on the whole issue of punishing people for violating laws. Those are going to be three separate videos which will complete our work on Mill, except for reviewing and applying his theory of ethics. For the most part, Mill believes that justice has to do with following the law of the nation we're a part of, because this is what will lead to the greatest happiness. At least in the case of civilized nations, their societies have been organized in certain ways through legislation in order to promote the well-being of the society as a whole without violating anyone's rights. And we certainly have this idea in the United States, where we call the courts and prisons the justice system, and the judges of our Supreme Court are themselves called justices because they somehow personify justice for us. And when they decide a case, their standard is to look at the highest law of the land, the Constitution. Something that is unconstitutional is considered to be unjust according to our system of laws. So again, Mill wants to grant that in general, justice equals following the law. And what is ethical and what is legal are the same. But there's an asterisk next to justice on the slide. There are important cases where justice and ethical don't match. That happens most dramatically when we discover that a nation has laws that are themselves unjust. If justice equals law, this should not be possible. So we'll have to take a look at Mill's explanation in order to see what he means. Let's look at a passage from 242. It seems to be universally admitted that there may be unjust laws, and that law, consequently, is not the ultimate criterion of justice, but may give to one person a benefit or impose on another an evil, which justice condemns. When, however, a law is thought to be unjust, it seems always to be regarded as being so in the same way in which a breach of law is unjust, namely by infringing someone's right, which, as it cannot in this case be a legal right, receives a different appellation and is called a moral right. We may say, therefore, that a second case of injustice consists in taking or withholding from any person that to which he has a moral right. It's a second case because he's talked earlier about injustice having to do with taking something that belongs to someone as a legal right. So Mill acknowledges that sometimes a law can be unjust. Mill doesn't tell us what examples he's thinking of, but we can easily come up with some of our own. For example, slavery existed in the United States up until 1865, when the 13th Amendment to the Constitution was voted in. Now, that's more recent than you think. My grandfather owned a farm in Kentucky that my dad grew up on. There's a stone walkway leading up to the old farmhouse they lived in. That stone walkway, which is still there, was built with slave labor. There were still little houses around the main house that had been used as slave quarters a couple of generations before in my great-great-grandfather's time. My father literally grew up in the shadow of slavery. Now, it's not that enslaving another human being was illegal and people did it anyway. It was perfectly legal. It was illegal to break into someone's house and take their property, but it was legal to hold slaves. It was legal to treat some fellow human beings as property to be owned by others. If justice equals legality, then holding slaves before 1865 was a case of justice. Now that sounds wrong, and Mill would say that it is wrong. Again, holding slaves was a legal right in the US before 1865. But Mill points out in the passage that we read that upholding a legal right may, quote, give to one person a benefit or impose on another an evil, which justice condemns, end quote. Slavery is a great example for this. The legal right to own other human beings conferred on one person, a slaveholder, is a benefit which justice condemns. It also imposes on another person, the human being who is enslaved, an evil which justice condemns. This is a case where Mill would say the slaveholder never had a moral right to own another person, even though he had a legal right to do it. And the slaves had no legal right to freedom, but they had a moral right to it all along. So since it was an unjust law, it needed to be overturned, which shows us how legal rights sometimes conflict with moral rights. A more recent example would be same-sex marriage. Prior to June 26, 2015, marriage was not considered a legal right of same-sex couples at the federal level. States had a legal right to regulate marriage, including the right to deny marriage to same-sex couples. Most of us think that same-sex couples had a moral right to marry all along. That would mean that the Supreme Court in June 2015 did not create a new right to marry. What it did was to bring guaranteed legal rights into harmony with already long-standing moral rights. Keep in mind that legal rights and moral rights often overlap, but where they conflict, we have an unjust law. In these situations, justice dictates that we change the law to preserve moral rights. A legal right is not a moral right. If it infringes somebody's moral right, it produces an unjust law which needs to be changed. So this is the first of two cases where justice and legality are not the same. The second case essentially goes in the other direction. Ordinarily, we think that a person has a moral duty to be impartial. Two examples. A judge in a court case must be impartial and not favor one party over the other. When the government is choosing employees, not elected employees, but appointed other employees. Sorry. The second case essentially goes in the other direction. Ordinarily, we think that a person has a moral duty to be impartial, to treat everyone equally. Two examples. A judge in a court case must be impartial and not favor one party over the other. Likewise, when the government is choosing employees, it cannot favor certain groups over others. For most government jobs, you have a civil service exam, and jobs are distributed on the basis of scores on the civil service exam. Higher level jobs, the State Department has an exam for high level jobs like jobs in A second case essentially goes in the other direction. Ordinarily, we think that a person has a moral duty to be impartial. Two examples. A judge in a case must be impartial and not favor one party over the other. When the government is choosing employees, it cannot favor certain groups over others. So the US government uses the civil service exam for most government jobs, and there's the State Department exam for high-level jobs such as those in US embassies overseas. So again, ordinarily, we think justice and impartiality are the same, but there's an asterisk on the slide. The asterisk is we are not expected under ethics or justice to be impartial when it comes to our friends and our families. Buy gifts for them on their birthdays and not for strangers, or do other nice things for them. Provided we're not violating anyone else's rights, There's nothing immoral or unjust about our partiality. We are not ethically required in those cases to be impartial. Friendship is also a case where we're not impartial, but this is not considered immoral. We favor certain people over others because we feel more drawn to them or more comfortable with some people than others. We can't be friends with everyone, and no one has a right to our friendship. So it is not unjust for us to choose some people as friends and not to become friends with others. Those are the two cases, the unjust law and our relationships to friends and family, where justice and impartiality are not the same thing. We can be partial, in other words, biased, in favor of friends and family without being unjust. In the next video, we'll have a look at Mill's fascinating ideas on taxes. Now, most of you don't find taxes fascinating unless you're majoring in finance. And I'm guessing that very few of you think of taxes as an important issue of ethics and justice. I intend, over the next few minutes, to change your mind, to convince you, first, that taxes are fascinating, and second, that they're a very big ethical issue indeed.